an attack on Bitcoin is an attack on free speech, it's an attack on freedom, it's an attack on liberty, and we must stand up for those rights. That's our duty as Americans.
All right, the founder and CEO of the Digital Chamber, Perianne Boring, thank you so much for being here.
So good to be here, Zach.
It's a very exciting time right now in crypto. You're on the sidelines of Token in Dubai. Right now, it seems like everyone's focused on the geopolitics of crypto and kind of how it's also similarly impacted by all the news, which, you know, people are debating whether or not Bitcoin is a flight to safety, an inflation hedge. What do you make of kind of what we're seeing right now in the market?
I think this is one of the most important conversations that investors, particularly institutional investors, are having about Bitcoin, especially as we've just had the spot Bitcoin ETFs approved in the United States just a couple of months ago. We're starting to see very real institutional flows into this asset class. Why? What is the value of Bitcoin? I think one of the strongest cases for why someone would want to buy Bitcoin, why you would have an investor invest in Bitcoin, why you would put it on the balance sheet, has to do with economic uncertainty. Bitcoin is an uncorrelated asset. Traditionally, gold has played the role of this in a portfolio. But Bitcoin is superior to gold for the 21st century for a number of reasons, and investors are starting to see this. There's been a lot of questions about, well, what happened over the weekend here, where the price of Bitcoin declined when we saw Iran's efforts in Israel, not getting into the politics or kind of the national security piece, just really focusing on how Bitcoin is performing in these moments. Mm-hmm. Where there's been a lot of criticism of, well, if Bitcoin's really a store of value, why would the price decline when you're having this major world event happen? And I think it's just important to understand that Bitcoin doesn't really care what's happening in Iran. These are not necessarily the most rational markets. These are still very nascent. The technology is still very young. And it's important to zoom out and look at the larger picture. Mm-hmm. Over the past 15 years since Bitcoin has been trading, it's been the best performing asset 12 out of those years.
So it'd be a little short-sighted to maybe just look at one weekend of geopolitical events and say, all right, Bitcoin has failed the test of being everything that it was promised to be.
Well, that, and also there's a lot of factors that go into the price of Bitcoin at any moment in time. You have to understand these spot Bitcoin ETFs have only been trading for a couple of months. So now you have markets where Bitcoin is trading on traditional trading hours, but there's other markets, the spot markets, where it's still trading 24/7. Mm-hmm. All of this hasn't really worked out into perfect parity yet. So it's going to take time for the liquidity to get there, for the infrastructure to get there to see Bitcoin performing perfectly as an uncorrelated asset. There's been a lot of criticism on that, but that doesn't necessarily take away from the case that this is superior technology to gold for a store of value. It can be used in economic uncertainty. We have many, many examples going all the way back to 2013 of communities using Bitcoin in moments when there are economic uncertainties and they're looking for an alternative place for a store of value.
I think for a lot of U.S. investors too, they look at it through obviously a U.S. lens and look at it in terms of an inflation hedge and our inflation rate, but globally, the U.S.'s inflation rate kind of looks like a joke relative to some of the other countries out there, and really a lot of people now, including Larry Fink, are talking about it more as a currency devaluation hedge, which seems to be a narrative that has been proven true. I mean, what do you make of, I guess, the way that these narratives do evolve over time and the differences between U.S. investors looking at it and global investors, really?
It's interesting. In the United States, we very much take advantage of the fact, or undervalue the fact, that we live in one of the most prosperous nations in the world. We largely have access to financial services, where that's not the case in a lot of other places globally. So sometimes as Americans, it's really hard to understand the value of a permissionless technology where you don't need to use a third party, you don't need you don't need to be permissioned into any type of network to have access to financial services.
Yeah.
So I think that in itself is just important, that this technology is going to service people outside of the current system. But it's also important to recognize where we are in the global economic landscape.
Yeah.
We are facing systemic issues we've seen the challenges in the banking system over the past year, multiple banks having to be completely rearranged, a lot of challenges just in the banking system itself. You talk about inflation, and when we talk about the rate of inflation, we're looking at the consumer price index, which isn't an accurate measure of inflation. It's a measure of the symptom of inflation. M2, the actual monetary supply, has been has grown at historic rates. So the true expansion of the monetary base is unprecedented.
Yeah, and increasingly becoming a problem just in terms of the debt levels that continue to be a problem.
Then you have irresponsible government spending, particularly in the United States, where debt is just completely unsustainable. So you start layering all of these factors, geopolitical issues, economic uncertainty, rising prices of inflation, unsustainable debt, and people really do need a place to go.
And we are seeing that flight now into Bitcoin, probably, as you said, part of the reasons why we've seen it perform year after year for the last 15 years. When you do look at regulation, though, in the US, you guys at the Digital Chamber have been on the forefront of, I think, defending against failures on the regulatory front. We've talked about a lot of them. We've talked. It's a lot. It's busy work. We've talked a lot of them at the EIA and the legal actions you guys participated in against them. Mostly seen as an overreach by the EIA and trying to get into who can and cannot use energy to mine Bitcoin, as well as a continued battle against Elizabeth Warren and her quote-unquote anti-crypto army. I mean, why don't you just put into context kind of how important 2024 is for the entire industry as we face a pretty important election?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. As we're we're in an election year, we're entering the elections. It's really important just to understand where we stand politically. We are facing political attacks from the highest level of government. The EIA, where there was this emergency survey put on the Bitcoin mining industry, is just really one example of a coordinated political attack that's coming from members of the U.S. Senate, Elizabeth Warren being kind of the pinnacle of that. So this election is absolutely critical. Another 4 years of a Biden administration will likely result in more legal actions, more enforcement actions, more legal costs for the industry. Important races, I think, are the Senate. There's extremely important races happening in Ohio, where we have the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown, who is very close with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who ultimately wants to completely disrupt and push the crypto industry overseas. He's in a very tight race against Bernie Moreno, who just won the GOP nomination. Sherrod Brown's been in office for 30
Forever.
years.
Yeah.
Chairman of one of the most high-ranking committees. And his opponent is a pro-Bitcoin, pro-blockchain opponent, which would send a very strong message to Washington that we do not want government restricting the people's access to open source technologies.
It's a hot race to watch. I feel like we were talking before, the race in Massachusetts is also an interesting one with John Deaton throwing his hat into the ring. I mean, is it fair to say that your position is that, so much attention is always on the presidential election, but really I think the battlegrounds in the Senate elections might be even more important?
Yeah, these Senate elections are extremely important. John Deaton is a very strong contender against Elizabeth Warren. There's a lot of opinions. Can anyone beat Elizabeth Warren given the stronghold she has in the Democratic Party? But I think the most important thing for our community is that we participate politically. We participate in political activities and we vote. That includes the people of Massachusetts. That includes the people of Ohio. So whether that's the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, or even state races, it's important that all people understand who they're voting for. You get the people you're voting for, the people in office, get them on record. What is their position on their Americans' access to open source technologies? And if it's anything less, then we should have full access to these technologies.
Full stop.
Vote them out.
I feel like people forget about the importance of that too, right? So much attention is really put on the SEC as one of the main regulators here, but I think that's another example of disappointment for people in the industry. You know, I've chatted with Hester Peirce a number of times talking about, I really hope we don't have to go through the same song and dance of a lawsuit to get an approval for ETH ETFs, the same way that it had to happen with Grayscale in their battle versus the SEC for Bitcoin ETFs. And yet here we are, approaching the deadline at the end of May, and it seems as if that's exactly what's going to play out again, which, I mean, how disappointing is that as someone who really has been at the forefront of defending the industry against everything that's happened? How disappointing is it to see potentially the same thing happen again?
The courts and the legal process have really been the last bastion of hope for the digital asset ecosystem, but there have been some extremely successful and promising cases just over the past couple of months. You mentioned the EIA, the U.S. Department of Energy. So this was a political attack coming from the Department of Energy on Bitcoin. We participated in a legal action with a number of other people in the industry sued, and they dropped the survey. So essentially, you know, we won that battle. So it shouldn't come to this. It should not come to having to go into litigation against the federal government just for some of the most, you know, simple things to be able to move forward in this space. But we're very grateful for the court system, and it has been one of the most important tools to have sound policy for digital assets.
We're here in Dubai, and obviously a lot of people have been talking about potential approvals, imminent approvals for an ETH ETF and Bitcoin ETF in Hong Kong. If you ask the issuers, very much there. But it also maybe speaks to the idea of the US potentially falling behind as well. Again, as a lot of people said, all right, great, finally you got a Bitcoin ETF, but that was after other markets. I mean, how do you look at the global kind of race in the sense of getting this right, and where the US falls in that?
Well, the United States loss is the rest of the world's benefit. We are the center of the capital markets. Everybody wants access to the US markets. There's a lot of competition to get into the US markets, but the US regulatory system really has not done a very good job of creating a regulatory environment for the digital asset industry, which has led to many other nations, including the UAE and Dubai, to develop a more competitive regulatory structure. So I think time will tell where the global hubs for crypto end up being. I do believe the US will be one of those hubs, but it'll be one of those hubs. Yep. I think there will be other hubs. Hong Kong is absolutely a place of extreme interest for the industry, the UAE as well, and the United States. So I think time will tell who's going to be the leader, but I don't think it's going to be this unipolar dominant market as we've seen in other industries.
To wrap up, I mean, you're one of the smartest people I think that I enjoy chatting with in this industry, but when you look at things that might be being overlooked right now, potential risks or potential upside opportunities, looking ahead to end 2024, which is arguably already off to a very good start, what are you looking at now, and what's kind of one thing on your radar?
I think the biggest risk are these political risks. A lot of times they don't make sense. There's not like logic and common sense that go into political attacks, and they're not stopping. So the biggest worry that I have is essentially this piece of legislation that Senator Elizabeth Warren is spearheading. I've dubbed her the #1 crypto lobbyist because she has secured and convinced 20% of the US Senate to join her in taking the position of completely banning crypto in the United States altogether. So while this bill likely would not be passed into law this year, given how the House is currently structured, the fear is that what about next year? There's an election at the end of this year. We don't know who's going to be the chair of each committees. We don't necessarily know who's going to have majority in which chambers at this point in time. We can all predict it, but there is no guarantee that we would be able to set up a blockade like we have currently. This bill could resurrect. So if the political pieces fall in the right place, could a bill like this pass into law? Absolutely, which is why we need to send that clear message to Washington to ensure this type of proposal
How crippling,
never resurrects again.
How crippling would that be, though, if it were that case?
It would be absolutely devastating. So the text of this legislation would essentially make it impossible to mine Bitcoin in the United States in a legally compliant way. So a lot of these companies that are doing the majority of the mining are public companies, so they're going to be regulatory and legal risk averse by nature, so they're going to face some extremely tough decisions, which would be devastating to the entire mining industry. It does the same thing for any type of node validation. So this isn't just about the Bitcoin blockchain, it's about all blockchains. How do we validate and authenticate transactions? All of that would not be able to be done in a legally compliant way. It also bans self-hosted wallets. You could not operate a self-hosted wallet legally. Now, arguably, this is, the enforceability of this is extremely questionable, and the first thing we would do is mount a massive legal action to counter all of this.
Yep.
But what type of business can operate in that type of environment? If you have legislation enacted that said you can't do this, but then you've got litigation underway, it's not a favorable business environment.
Yep.
So it would completely devastate the industry. It would push a lot of this overseas, but I think it would be devastating to the markets overall and personal access to an open source technology. I think this, an attack on Bitcoin is an attack on free speech, it's an attack on freedom, it's an attack on liberty, and we must stand up for those rights. That's our duty as Americans.
And it's important, and again, you've been leading the charge, so I appreciate everything that you've done at the Digital Chamber. Perianne Boring, the founder of the Digital Chamber, thank you so much again for your time.
Thanks, Zach.